In our videos, we often debunk rather absurd historical beliefs and myths on various topics. So why not do the same with Atlantis? Yes, the fact of its existence hasn't been definitively proven, nor has its location. But over the years, scientists have incredibly narrowed down the search for Atlantis and debunked thousands of myths associated with it. And instead of chilling tales about crystals, aliens, and Anunnaki, we can talk about Atlantis using solid facts, which we'll explore over the next few minutes. Did you know that, technically, the Mediterranean Sea should be called the Atlantic, and that the ocean mistakenly received that name? Don't go anywhere. There are plenty more amusing details like this to come. But first, let's summarize what Atlantis actually is. It's a hypothetical island nation that supposedly existed many thousands of years ago and reached great heights of power. Most of what we know about it comes from the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. In his dialogue Critias, he gave an extremely detailed description of the geography, history, and downfall of Atlantis. During the Renaissance, and especially in our own dark age of conspiracy theories, Atlantis captured imaginations and gave rise to countless theories. According to Plato, Atlantis vanished around 9500 BC. It was inhabited by enormous titans led by Poseidon, with King Atlas at the helm, after whom the island was named. Plato went into striking detail, claiming that elephants roamed the land. The army boasted 10,000 chariots and 1,000 ships, and a massive temple stood in the center of the island. It's worth noting that Plato wasn't the only one to describe Atlantis. Hellanicus, a contemporary of Herodotus, also mentioned the descendants of the Titan Atlas, who supposedly founded a powerful maritime civilization long ago. However, he associated them with the Minoan civilization of Crete, which did indeed clash with Athens at one point. Roughly speaking, references to Atlantis do appear across ancient Greek philosophers and historians. But the details differ wildly, and that's the main trap. Knowing this, you can safely stop watching any conspiracy video about Atlantis in the first second. Because, simply put, the ancient Greeks were unreliable sources of information. The best example is the Greco-Persian War, which has been thoroughly studied thanks to numerous records. And yet, Plato's allegory of it looks quite different. Instead of a collection of fragmented city-states united only in the face of a terrifying threat, he portrays the Greeks as wise sages with Spartan physiques, advanced intellect, and powerful technology. Plato claims that after their victory, the Athenians gave freedom to all nations and didn't take a single coin from the defeated. In reality, of course, the Greeks turned their victory over the Persians into the foundation of their own empire. So, trusting Greek historians too much isn't the best idea. Everything said about Atlantis should be taken with a grain of salt, if not divided by 10, starting with its alleged age of 9,000 years. Even with modern research methods, we only get fragmentary data about such ancient times. It's doubtful that anything so far back could have made it to Plato. The same skepticism should apply to Atlantis's size, power, and geography. By applying current knowledge of geography, history, and geology, scientists have long since narrowed the myth of the lost island down to two main theories, and both share one key fact: Atlantis could not have been located in the Atlantic Sea. Which is rather ironic, considering the sea got its name from the supposedly sunken island. And all of this comes down to one simple thing: a complete lack of fact-checking by those who gave the names. The same ancient Greeks who described Atlantis and the war against it officially claimed they knew where the edge of the world was. According to the legend you've probably heard, Heracles journeyed to the farthest point of the known world, reaching the end of the Mediterranean Sea. When he encountered mountains in his path, he didn't hesitate to cut through them, creating what we now know as the Strait of Gibraltar. The two remaining cliffs, one on the European side and one on the African side, have since been called the Pillars of Hercules. Given the level of ancient seafaring, developed but still primitive, these pillars were considered by the Greeks and much of the Mediterranean world as the very edge of existence. In fact, the Phoenicians passed them, and even reached the coasts of the Atlantic, as far as Britain. But what matters here is that, in the era Plato was describing, the pillars were considered the end of the world. And if Athens supposedly fought Atlantis beyond them, the timeline doesn't add up, because Athens simply didn't have a fleet capable of reaching that far. So how did Plato end up describing a war with people from Atlantis, living beyond the Pillars of Hercules? As usual, there's no magic or mystery here. The truth is that there were at least 7 different Pillars of Hercules in the ancient world. Yes, the Strait of Gibraltar was the most important, but ancient sailors called almost every narrow sea passage the Pillars of Hercules. For example, the Bosporus, the Kerch Strait, the Dardanelles, and even the Nile Delta were sometimes framed by Heraclean pillars. This made sense to sailors. The pillars acted as natural landmarks, like lighthouses. But conspiracy theorists tend to forget the fact that there were multiple such pillars. And even if we choose to believe Plato, knowing this fact leads us to one conclusion. Atlantis must have been located in the Mediterranean Sea. When we study his writings further, we learn that the disappearance of Atlantis supposedly made it difficult for sailors to pass through the Pillars of Hercules and reach the open sea. That's because the island, destroyed by an earthquake, sank and left behind many shallow sandbanks that ships couldn't navigate. And do you know where Plato got this information? From an Egyptian priest named Timaeus, who lived 200 years before him and described problems with navigation near the Pillars of Hercules. But Timaeus most likely meant the Egyptian version of the pillars, located at the Nile Delta, where there was a city named after Heracles. Plato, without much concern for precision, took his words and applied them to the better-known Gibraltar Pillars. And that's where many modern misconceptions about Atlantis and even the name of the Atlantic Ocean come from. The Greeks named it, of course, sometimes referring to the sea surrounding Atlantis, and sometimes to Atlas, the mythical king of Atlantis who held up the sky. Later followers, not too bothered by historical accuracy, opened up the Atlantic Ocean and simply gave it the name. But they forgot to consult the original source, Timaeus, who had long since passed away. So, originally, the Atlantic Sea and the mysterious homeland of the Atlanteans were located in the Mediterranean Sea. At least, that's what a simple analysis of the facts clearly suggests. A civilization located in the Mediterranean Sea is one the Greeks could have actually fought. Moreover, according to Plato himself, the victory over the Atlanteans allowed the Greeks to liberate even the Egyptians. It would be strange if they had been enslaved by people living thousands of kilometers away in the Atlantic Ocean, wouldn't it? So this detail also strongly suggests that if mythical Atlantis ever existed, it belonged in the Mediterranean, close enough to both Egypt and Greece for such events to make sense. And this brings us to the three most logical theories. First theory, Atlantis never existed at all. Plato simply invented another moral tale about gods and mortals, something the Greeks were known to do often. Second theory, Plato took a real historical event from the distant past and embellished it. This theory sounds the most reasonable, because it's typical of Greek storytelling, where real kings often turned into demigods with superpowers in their chronicles. By this logic, it's quite possible that there was a real island nation in the Mediterranean that fought against Athens and Egypt. This is very believable, especially since mini-states were common in that era. Take, for example, the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete. The Mediterranean Sea was full of city-states, and around the 16th century BC, the volcano Santorini on the island of Thera erupted, causing a massive disaster in the region. This catastrophe shattered the power of the Minoan civilization and quite likely wiped out the people on the island, which, just like in the legends, disappeared beneath the sea. Right now, the Greeks are conducting numerous excavations on the island and are indeed finding evidence of an advanced civilization on the island of Thera, attributing its inhabitants to the Minoan civilization. It's entirely possible that, at a certain point in history, they really did wage war against Athens, a fact on which Plato likely based his moral tale. Almost everything aligns with this theory. The aftermath of the catastrophe and the resulting tsunami definitely reached Egypt, as later recorded by the ancient writer Timaeus. It's important to understand that for both storytellers, even the eruption of Santorini happened 1,000 years in the past, an incredibly long time. So, an exaggeration to 9,000 years is quite logical. This is probably the most rational and plausible theory, considering everything we've discussed so far. But for those who enjoy mystery and secrets, there's still some hope. Though not at the North Pole or wherever else people keep drawing poor Atlantis, you shouldn't look there. But in the Mediterranean, that's much more reasonable. And using our simple analysis and the latest scientific data, we can even outline a fairly limited search area. If such a large island existed even hypothetically, it should be searched for between Egypt, Cyprus, and Crete. At one time, land could theoretically have existed there. Historically, the African tectonic plate was drifting away from the Eurasian one. Geologists believe that, at some point, there were islands in the sea north of Africa. But rising sea levels submerged them. Right now, there's a depression there nearly 4 kilometers deep, and the moment of its formation likely looked catastrophic. The plates simply parted, plunging a vast area underwater. There's no mystery in the fact that Atlantis, if it ever existed there, hasn't been found yet. We're talking about a large and, more importantly, deep territory that takes a long time and considerable effort to study. Crete and Cyprus could have been part of an archipelago that sank, and people almost certainly lived there. We've always settled wherever it was possible. The problem is that solving such questions requires real science, not eccentric outsiders like Edgar Cayce, who wrote an entire book about Atlantis magical crystals, which is still cited by TV channels and even supposedly serious sources. And for reference, this same Cayce predicted that Atlantis would rise again in 1960, that Hitler would win World War II, and a bunch of other nonsense that never came true. His fans don't really have a reply for that. But if we apply common sense, facts, and science, everything becomes much simpler, yet no less fascinating. If you enjoyed this video, we'd love a like and your thoughts in the comments. See you next time.